July 17th, 1955. The gates of Disneyland swung open for the very first time. Children rushed forward, eyes wide. Parents followed, stunned that Main Street and castles, once only sketches on paper, now rose in front of them. Walt Disney stood quietly in the background, watching people step into a dream he once scribbled on a napkin. For decades, he had built worlds in ink and sound, Mickey Mouse, the City Symphonies, Snow White. Each one expanded what imagination could do. But now, Walt wanted something greater. He wanted people to live inside the story. What began as Disney's folly on the silver screen was now reborn as a kingdom beyond imagination, a place where fantasy touched reality. Getting here was anything but magical. In the years after Snow White, Walt's studio nearly collapsed under strikes, war, and financial strain. Bankers laughed at his plans for a park. Even his own brother, Roy, doubted whether the dream was possible. And when the gates finally opened, chaos greeted the world. Broken rides, counterfeit tickets, and plumbing failures hit so fierce that asphalt melted guests' shoes. The press called it Black Sunday. Yet within weeks, the crowds came. Within months, Disneyland became a cultural revolution. And within years, Walt's vision would stretch even further towards EPCOT, which stands for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow, a living city of the future. Today, we explore the final chapter of Walt Disney's path to greatness, how he transformed resilience into legacy and how his vision outlived even the man himself. Because Walt Disney reminds us, you don't just get to dream the future, you get to build it. Welcome to Path to Greatness, a special series within the Strategic Thinker. Here, we step inside the extraordinary journeys of icons and brands, not to admire them from afar, but to study the choices, struggles, and strategies that shaped their legacies. If you're joining for the first time, this is chapter 3 of our trilogy on Walt Disney. Each chapter stands on its own, but together they form a fuller picture of his extraordinary path. In chapter 1, we trace his spark of imagination and resilience through failure. In chapter 2, we explored how systems and risk transformed him from a storyteller to a world builder. And now, in this final chapter, we turn to vision and legacy, how Walt built not only films, but living worlds that outlasted his own life. So wherever you are listening from, whether you are leading a team, chasing a dream, or simply searching for your next step, I hope this story gives you both perspective and courage for your own path to greatness. Let's dive in and return to the story soon after Snow White. Snow White had been a triumph beyond anyone's imagination. By 1939, the Disney studio had money, prestige, and the kind of cultural momentum most creators only dream about. Hollywood insiders now spoke of Walt Disney not as a cartoonist, but as an innovator, a visionary who had expanded what film itself could be. But the irony of success is that it often sets expectations sky high. Walt had scaled the mountain once, and now the world demanded, what's next? Walt was never one to coast. Flush with Snow White's success, he poured resources into projects even more ambitious. In 1940, Pinocchio arrived, a film more technically advanced, more narratively daring than anything the studio had attempted. The water rippled with startling realism. The characters moved with nuance and gravity. Critics praised its artistry, but commercially it stumbled. Foreign markets, especially in Europe, were shuttered by the rising war. Domestically, audiences were smaller than hoped. The film couldn't recoup its cost. That same year, Fantasia pushed even further. It wasn't just a movie, it was an experiment, a marriage of classical music and animation, with no central narrative. just tone poems brought to life. Walt even introduced Fantasound, an early form of stereo sound audio. It was decades ahead of its time, but too far ahead. Most theaters weren't equipped for it. Many audiences weren't ready. They left puzzled, even bored. A year later came Bambi. Its delicate artistry, its focus on nature, and its infamous death scene made it an enduring classic. But in 1942, the war was escalating. Ticket sales faltered again. Within 3 years, Disney had released some of the most beautiful and daring animated films ever made and lost money on nearly all of them. The golden glow of Snow White was already fading. The pressure of these failures weighed heavily inside the studio walls. Animators, once inspired by Walt's charisma and vision, now felt ground down by his relentless perfectionism. They worked long hours, often for wages that lagged behind industry expectations. They saw Walt chasing vision after vision while the company's finances spiraled. In 1941, it boiled over in open revolt. The Disney's animators' strike was one of the most painful episodes of Walt's career. Picket lines formed outside the gates of the brand new Burbank studio. Animators carried signs, some featuring caricatures of Walt himself. Once their admired leader, now lampooned as a tyrant. They chanted in the Californian sun, and the passing cars honked in solidarity. Walt was stunned. Driving past the picket lines, he reportedly muttered that he no longer recognized the people he thought of as family. Some accounts say the bitterness of the strike never fully left him. To him, the strike was more than a labor dispute. It was a betrayal. Eventually, government mediators helped reach a settlement, but the damage was done. Morale fractured. Trust was shaken. Walt carried the wounds with him for the rest of his career. If the strike wasn't enough, another storm soon arrived. World War II. In December 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, US troops occupied parts of the Disney studio lot. Soldiers set up anti-aircraft guns on the grounds. Burbank, California became a military outpost. Walt's studio, once devoted to fairy tales, was pressed into service. Animators produced military training films, educational reels, and propaganda shorts. Titles like Victory Through Air Power and Education for Death carried messages far from dwarves and fairy queens. These films didn't generate big profits, but they kept the studio afloat. More importantly, they forced Walt's team to adapt, learning to deliver at scale under pressure with ruthless efficiency. There's even a persistent legend that Winston Churchill personally screened Victory Through Air Power and urged Roosevelt to watch it. The film's message about the strategic role of long-range bombing allegedly influenced Allied planning. Historians debate the exact influence, but the myth itself speaks volumes about Walt's reach. His team wasn't just entertaining, they were shaping perception in wartime. When the war ended, Disney faced yet another reality. Audiences had changed. The studio had survived, but overseas markets were slow to reopen. Money was tight, morale was bruised, and looming on the horizon was a new invention threatening Hollywood itself: the television. Most studios saw TV as the enemy, a box in the living room that would steal audiences from theaters, but Walt, true to form, saw possibility. He began to imagine shows that could bring Disney magic directly into homes, programs like the Mickey Mouse Club and Disneyland, which would later launch to massive success. In those years, though, the idea seemed rather radical, even foolish. Why would a filmmaker embrace the very thing others feared? But that was Walt's genius. Where others saw threats, he saw platforms. Looking back, it's tempting to see only the headline moments. Snow White, Disneyland, Mickey Mouse, and history is never a straight line. The 1940s were not Walt's golden decade. They were his survival decade. And survival is often underrated. It looks messy. It feels like compromise. But sometimes, survival is exactly what lays the groundwork for the next leap. The failed films pushed his team to innovate. The strike forced new structures. The war hardened their efficiency. And television cracked open a future no one else was brave enough to embrace. Walt Disney wasn't soaring in those years. He was weathering storms. But in that survival, he planted seeds for the kingdom beyond imagination. Where in your own journey might survival mode actually be laying groundwork for your next leap? By the late 1940s, Walt had survived the hardest decade of his career. The studio wasn't thriving, but it was alive, and that was enough. His animators had returned from war, the strike was fading in memory, and new projects were slowly restoring momentum. But Walt himself was restless. As his daughters grew, Walt spent weekends taking them to local amusement parks and carnivals around Los Angeles. He would sit on a bench eating peanuts while Diane and Sharon rode the merry-go-round. And he hated it. The rides were often shabby, pants chipped, barkers shouted at passers-by, carnivals smelled of dust and grease. To Walt, these weren't places of wonder. These were places that treated families like wallets. Legend has it that one day, sitting on a bench while his girls rode the Griffith Park carousel, the vision hit him. He imagined a place where families could spend time together, where parents and children share the same magic. No barkers, no grime. Only story, beauty, and care. Whether or not the exact moment unfolded that way, Walt would later point to that carousel bench as the birthplace of Disneyland. He began to sketch. At first, the drawings were simple: a town square, a castle, a few rides. But as with all Walt's dreams, the sketches grew. Soon there were lands with their own themes: the frontier land echoing the American West, an adventure land alive with jungles, Tomorrowland pointing to the future. These weren't just rides, they were worlds. Each one designed with narrative, architecture, and detail so rich that guests could step inside and believe. Walt carried these sketches into conversations with bankers, executives, and even friends in Hollywood. Almost everyone laughed. A theme park? Families wandering through fairy tale lands? It's a circus with extra paint, they said. You'll never make money. The phrase Disney's folly, once attached to Snow White, resurfaced again. But Walt pressed forward. He set up a small, secretive team within the company, WED Enterprises. Named after his initials, Walter alias Disney. On the surface, it was just another division. In reality, it was a laboratory for his wildest dream. WED engineers, soon nicknamed Imagineers, began experimenting with models, blueprints, and new ride mechanics. Walt poured his own money into the team, quietly funding designs long before the board or investors approved. One story, half myth, tells of Walt bringing home a napkin sketch of a park layout and pinning it to his wall. It wasn't polished, it wasn't official, but to him, it was real enough to nurture, piece by piece. On the other hand, convincing financiers was another story. Hollywood executives scoffed. Bankers ran the numbers and shook their heads. Amusement parks were notoriously risky, prone to failure. often left to rot after a few seasons, but Walt had two things going for him. His track record with innovation and his relentless storytelling. When he pitched Disneyland, he didn't talk about rides, he talked about experiences. The smell of popcorn on Main Street, the joy of boarding a steamboat, the awe of walking through a castle gate. He invited people not to invest in steel and paint, but in magic. Still, the numbers didn't add up. The skeptics didn't budge. Walt's solution was as radical as it was risky. He turned to television, the very medium most Hollywood leaders dismissed as a threat. In 1954, Walt struck a deal with ABC. In exchange for financing part of the park, Walt would produce a weekly TV program called Disneyland. The show would showcase behind-the-scenes footage of the park's construction, clips of Disney films, and news stories crafted for TV audiences. It was brilliant. Not only did Walt secure funding, but he also created anticipation. Millions of Americans tune in each week, watching the dream of Disneyland take shape before their eyes. By the time the gates opened, guests didn't just know about Disneyland, they already felt part of it. Looking back, it's clear Disneyland didn't start as a business plan, it started as a hope. A father on a carousel bench wishing for something better for his daughters. But the lesson runs deeper. Vision often looks unreasonable at first, especially when you are inventing something no one has seen. Airplanes, iPhones, video calls, all were marked before they became indispensable. For Walt, it wasn't just about building rides. It was about building worlds and convincing people to believe in them before they existed. That kind of vision doesn't grow out of spreadsheets. It grows out of imagination, persistence, and the courage to chase an idea that sounds impossible. What idea of yours might sound unreasonable today, but could reshape the future if you pursued it? Before we go further into how Walt actually built Disneyland, let me pause here for just a moment. You are listening to Path to Greatness, part of the Strategic Thinker. If Walt Disney so far is striking a chord, make sure you are following the show so you won't miss future episodes. And if you want to explore these ideas more deeply, head over to maisontsc.com or connect with us on socials. That's where I explore some thoughts and ideas, share tools and guides to help you on your own path to greatness. Alright, let's get back to the story. By 1954, the dream was out in the open. Millions of Americans had seen Disneyland teased on television. Models were unveiled. Constructions began in Anaheim, California, on land that not long before had been fields of orange groves. The clock was ticking. Walt had promised to deliver Disneyland in just over a year. From the beginning, everything about the project seemed impossible. The chosen land was swampy, prone to flooding, and far from Hollywood glamour. The site needed massive grading just to make it buildable. Costs mounted faster than anyone expected. The budget, initially projected at around $5 million, soon ballooned past $17 million. Roy, the ever-cautious brother, scrambled to line up financing, while Walt pushed forward with stubborn confidence. Deadlines loomed. Crews worked around the clock. Cement trucks lined up for miles. Stories circulated of Walt walking the site daily, often with a cigarette in hand, pointing to half-finished buildings and insisting, "We open in July." What made construction even harder was Walt's obsession with detail. To him, Disneyland wasn't a park, It was a stage, and the guests were the audience. He insisted trash cans be placed no more than 30 steps apart, reasoning that's how far someone would walk with a wrapper before dropping it. He tested sightlines from every angle, ensuring that when you stood on Main Street, your view of Sleeping Beauty Castle felt perfectly framed. He ordered that smells, popcorn, vanilla, and even fresh paint be piped into certain areas to create an atmosphere of delight. Critics roll their eyes. Who notices trash can spacing? Who cares about the smell of vanilla in the air? But Walt knew. Details mattered. Details were the story. On July 17th, 1955, Disneyland opened its gates to the public. It was a day broadcast live on ABC, a spectacle meant to showcase Walt's dream to the entire country. But almost everything went wrong. The temperature soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt, poured just days earlier, softened in the heat. Women's high heels sank into the pavement. Water fountains failed because plumbers had been forced to choose between finishing fountains or restrooms. Walt chose restrooms. The result? Thirsty crowds, frustrated parents. To make matters worse, thousands of counterfeit tickets had circulated. Where they expected 11,000 guests, more than 28,000 showed up. Nights jammed, rides broke down. Paint was still drying on some buildings. The press called it Black Sunday. Headlines mocked the chaos. Insiders whispered that Disneyland was doomed. And yet, even with all the flaws, something remarkable happened. Children's eyes widened as they saw the castle. Families cheered as the Mark Twain steamboat puffed along the river. Guests lined up for rides that transported them into fantasy, adventure, and tomorrow. The logistics were a disaster, but the vision was undeniable. Disneyland was more than a collection of rides. It was a world. And once guests stepped inside, they didn't want to leave. In the weeks that followed, crowds kept coming. By the end of the summer, Disneyland was no longer a gamble. It was a phenomenon. Some say that on the opening day, Walt slipped away from the crowds and found a bench near the castle. He sat quietly, watching families explore the park, hearing their laughter, seeing parents and children share the same joy. It's hard to prove whether the moment happened exactly that way, but the story feels true. Walt wasn't basking in applause. He was watching the dream come alive in the lives of others. The lesson of Disneyland's opening is about persistence. Execution doesn't mean flawless delivery. More often than not, it just needs to be good enough. It's about bringing a vision to life in a way people can feel, even if the first version is messy. Black Sunday was a fiasco on paper, but to the guests, Disneyland was magic. And magic is what lasts. Where are you holding back for perfect when delivering your vision, even imperfectly, could inspire people now? Disneyland was not just a success, it was a revolution. Within months of its 1955 opening, the park was drawing millions of visitors. Families traveled from across the United States, eager to step inside a place where fantasy felt real. Hollywood had scoffed, bankers had doubted, even Walt's own employees had wondered. And yet, the gates of Disneyland turned doubt into delight. But for Walt Disney, the park was never a finished product. It was a living stage, always evolving, always changing. He often said, Disneyland will never be completed as long as there is imagination left in the world. The park quickly paid back its skeptics. Revenue soared, merchandise expanded, television specials broadcast the magic nationwide. Foreign leaders visited to study it, corporate executives toured to understand its design. Even rival studios grudgingly admitted that Walt had invented something new, an entire category of entertainment. But Walt's mind rarely lingered on victories. He was already sketching what came next. In the early 1960s, Walt began looking east. California was thriving, but its space was limited. Disneyland was hemmed in by hotels, highways, and billboards. Walt dreamed of more land, more control, more possibility, so he turned to Florida, a flat, sprawling canvas. Through a series of secret land deals, Disney representatives quietly purchased thousands of acres near Orlando. Using fake company names to disguise their identity, they acquired swamps, forests, and farmland at bargain prices. By the time the truth leaked, Disney had assembled a property larger than Manhattan. But Walt wasn't interested in building just another Disneyland. He envisioned something far bolder. In Walt's imagination, Florida would host not just rides, but a city, a living, breathing community where new technologies could be tested, where people would live in futuristic homes, where industry and research would work side by side with residents. He called it EPCOT, the Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. In 1966, Walt even filmed a presentation to explain his vision. With his calm voice and trademark optimism, he described a city under a giant dome, filled with innovations in transportation, communication, and design. He wanted it to be a laboratory for the future, constantly evolving, never static. Some myths suggest Walt carried EPCOT sketches with him even in the hospital, sketching layouts on paper from his bed, while the details were debated. What's certain was that EPCOT consumed his thoughts in his final years. But time was running out. In the mid-1960s, Walt's health began to fail. A lifetime of smoking caught up with him. Doctors discovered lung cancer. Surgery removed one lung, but the disease spread. Still, he worked. Colleagues recalled him standing over maps of Florida, pointing out roads and waterways, discussing EPCOT as if he had decades ahead. Even when confined to the hospital, he reportedly looked at ceiling tiles and used them as makeshift map, visualizing the layout of his dream city. Then there's the myth of the night walks. Some say Walt would slip quietly into Disneyland after closing, strolling the streets of Main Street, USA, or standing alone by the castle. He would bend down to pick up trash, test the lighting, or simply watch how the park felt without the crowds. No one can say for certain how often it happened, but the story captures a truth. Walt was never finished shaping the world he imagined. On December 15th, 1966, Walt Disney passed away at the age of 65. The world mourned. Newspaper declared the end of an era. For millions, it felt as if imagination itself had lost its greatest dreamer. But Walt's legacy was not buried with him. His brother Roy, who had spent much of his life playing the cautious counterbalance, took up the mantle. He delayed retirement and oversaw the completion of Walt Disney World in Florida. When the park opened in 1971, Roy insisted it bear his brother's name, Walt Disney World. He wanted the world to remember whose vision had made it possible. Roy himself passed away just months later, but the deed was done. EPCOT, as Walt had envisioned it, was never built. Instead, A theme park inspired by the idea opened in 1982. It wasn't a living city, but it carried echoes of Walt's dream, a place where innovation and imagination could meet. By then, the Disney brand was no longer just about films and characters, it was about entire worlds. Walt had expanded storytelling from sketches to screens, to parks, to cities. His influence stretched into culture, design, business, and imagination itself. And he had done it not by chasing trends, but by inventing them. The lesson of Walt's final years is profound. True legacy comes not from what you built in your lifetime, but from the systems, culture, and stories you leave behind. Walt didn't live to see Walt Disney World. He never walked through EPCOT, but he designed the vision, the teams, and the momentum that carried forward after him. That's legacy by design. What part of your work will be designed today to keep growing even after you're gone? From the survival years of the 1940s through the audacious dream of Disneyland to the unfinished vision of EPCOT, Walt Disney's final chapter was more than creating entertainment. It was also about legacy. He proved that imagination didn't need to stay on paper. It could shape parks, cities, and futures. And even when his time ran out, the systems, culture, and stories he left behind carried the work forward. Let's pause and draw out the lessons from this final act of Walt's journey. Resilience in adversity. After Snow White, Walt's world looked golden. But then came failure, strikes, and war. Some leaders might have faded. Walt adapted, pivoted, and survived. Where in your life might survival mode be the soil of your next leap? Audacious vision. A father on a carousel bench imagined a park where families could dream together. Everyone laughed, but Walt built it anyway, and the world has never stopped visiting. What idea of yours might sound unreasonable today, but could reshape the future if you pursued it? Imperfect execution still inspires. Disneyland's Black Sunday was a logistical disaster. Asphalt melted, rides broke, yet guests left enchanted. Why? Because the vision was stronger than the flaws. Where are you holding back for perfect when your vision, even imperfectly delivered, could inspire today? Legacy by design. EPCOT was never realized as Walt dreamed, but his teams carried on, opening Walt Disney World in his honor. Legacy wasn't left to chance, it was designed. What part of your work could be designed today to keep growing, even after you're gone? And so, the trilogy comes to a close. In Chapter 1, we saw how imagination sparked in a boy sketching on scraps of paper, how resilience carried him through failure, and how a mouse named Mickey became more than a cartoon. He became an asset. In Chapter 2, we watch Walt scale creativity into systems, persist through ridicule, and risk everything for Snow White, turning what critics marked as Disney's folly into a triumph that redefined cinema. And now, in Chapter 3, we follow him into the kingdom beyond imagination, Disneyland, EPCOT, and the legacy that still shapes culture today. Together, these chapters reveal the essence of Walt Disney's path to greatness: imagination as compass, systems as amplifiers, persistence through ridicule, risk as installments, legacy by design. And they remind us, greatness isn't built in a straight line. It's built in sparks, in struggles, in unreasonable dreams, and in systems that outlast the dreamer. Walt Disney didn't just dream the future, he built it. And he left behind a blueprint that invites each of us to ask, what future could I imagine? And what legacy will I design to outlive me? This concludes our 3-part Path to Greatness journey with Walt Disney. If this chapter spoke to you, I encourage you to go back and listen to all 3 chapters in order. Each one builds on the other, and together they offer not just a story of a man, but a toolkit for any of us daring enough to dream. And if this trilogy sparks something for you, share it with someone who might need courage for their own folly. Remind them, imagination is not just for dreamers, it's for builders. And to me, the best thing about dreams is you don't just get to dream the future, you get to build it. For deeper dives and exclusive reflections, join the waitlist for the Listening Room at masontst/listening room, our inner circle where we share early access, private notes, and frameworks to help you design your own path to greatness. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. You hold the power to shape your destiny. Strategic thinking is your compass. We will build an amazing future, one thoughtful decision at a time. Until next time, keep getting better every day.